This week on Learning How to Light, we're going to talk about dynamic range and contrast control. Effectively, we're talking about how you get those incredibly light things and incredibly dark things in the real world into your photograph. Remember, this is one part of a nearly 6-month-long How to Light course that I'm releasing every week on YouTube. Obviously subscribe so you get notifications, hit like if you like it, stick any questions you've got in the comments below, and let's get stuck in. So I want to talk about 3 things that are going to try and bring together those 4 basic characteristics of light and explain how they work with each other, and hopefully also give you some idea of how in day-to-day life when you're photographing things you will apply those principles. Okay, the first of these isn't really part of the 4 characteristics as such, but it's a facet of photography where lighting often plays a part. Let's talk about dynamic range and contrast control. Lots of what we've been talking about concerns using lighting to create effects. We might want to light things a certain way to create a certain mood or drama, or be flattering or reveal texture. Now, all of those are great, but I suggest it's better to think of skill in lighting as simply allowing you to create the look you want, and that look might not actually be the most exciting thing going. Often your ability to light well will allow you to deal with high contrast subjects and bring something called the dynamic range within the boundaries of what your camera can faithfully record. Dynamic range sounds very clever and intellectual, but essentially we can think of it as how wide the range is from the brightest highlight to the darkest shadow in a scene. If you picture an overcast, foggy day, there won't be much difference between the brightest parts of the sky and the deepest shadows of something on the ground. Come back to exactly the same scene a day later when the sun is out, and the brightest parts of the sky will be many times brighter than the darkest shadows. There will be a much larger dynamic range. Now, this is a problem because cameras can't record as big a dynamic range as we think, and our eyes are generally more sensitive than our cameras. The numbers vary from camera to camera, but most decent modern cameras can record a dynamic range of something like 7 stops, from the deepest shadow to the brightest highlight. And our eyes can generally see somewhere in the region of 10 stops. What this means in practice is that in scenes with a large dynamic range, such as this scene of a park on a bright sunny day, we've either got to choose which end of the scale we want to keep detail in, shadow or highlight, or, and this is where lighting comes in, we add light in some way to bring the dynamic range down. Now, starting here with a decent average exposure that tries to balance shadows and highlights, we can see that the areas that are broadly average, like the grass, look okay. But the brightest parts of the image, such as the sky, are very washed out, and the darkest shadows are incredibly dense and black with almost no detail in them. Now, we can alter our exposure to get some detail in the highlights, but of course in doing so the shadows will block up completely. Or we can switch this round, bring out details from the shadows, but the brighter parts of the scene will blow out and lose detail. Now, we can use something called high dynamic range, HDR, which combines several different exposures into one image to bring detail back into both ends of the scale. There are a couple of problems with this though. First off, it works much better with static subjects like this landscape and would really struggle if there was much movement between the different frames it was blending from. And secondly, although this is just my opinion, I always find HDR images look very artificial with strange ghosting effects around the edges like you see here. I find it better to introduce light into the darker areas in some way, expose for the highlights or close to them, and then let your light lift the shadows, essentially bringing the dynamic range down and shrinking it somewhat. Now, this can be done with an actual light. In this example, a flash with a softbox attached was used to lift the shadows to within the same range as the highlight areas visible in the window behind the subject. You can see here what happens if we take an exposure without the flash on, while still exposing for the scenery in the background. Or you can lighten the shadows with a reflector, such as the example of Paula Radcliffe. Since I'm shooting straight into the sun, Paula's face is in shadow. If I expose for her face, which obviously is darker, most of the background will be very bright indeed and will lose lots of the atmosphere from the shot. Instead, by exposing closer to the daylight and then bouncing light back onto her face with this reflector, we can bring the dynamic range back to a point where the camera can record detail right across the board. In this case, we're using a handheld reflector. You could easily use something like a conveniently located white wall. When you reduce the dynamic range in an image, you're essentially lowering the amount of contrast. Now at first this can seem like a backward step. Contrast in an image can be very appealing and give an image lots of punch. However, the golden rule is, it is always easier to add contrast afterwards than to try and remove it. It's very quick and easy to take an image with low contrast and then add contrast using something like the curves in Photoshop, rather than try to bring back shadows that have gone black or highlights that have blown out. Look how much better this image looks when we add contrast versus this one when I try to reduce the contrast and bring back detail into the shadows. So to summarise dynamic range, remember that your eyes can take in more than your camera can, so you'll either have to choose between keeping detail in the shadows or in the highlights. You can use lighting of some sort to reduce the contrast in an image, and don't forget, it's easier to punch contrast up in post-processing than try to reduce it. Okay, I hope that was useful, guys. I'm going to talk about feathering next week, which sounds terribly fancy. As always, like if you like it, subscribe, etc, 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 and I'll see you next week.